Welcome into the One South Coast Chamber podcast, the official podcast of the One South Coast Chamber, serving the business communities of southeastern Massachusetts. Today, I'm your host, Ian Trombly, Vice President of Public Policy, and today we're doing a Policy Pulse edition. An edition where we discuss different public policies and the impacts they have on the business communities here in southeastern Massachusetts. For today's episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by someone I consistently lean on for their expertise and experience in state finance and government. Someone who state leaders and decision makers rely on for forecasting and outlooks, the president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, Doug Howgate. Doug, welcome in.
Thanks so much for having me, Ian.
No, glad to have you. So, Doug, to kick things off, do you mind telling the people and listeners a little bit about what MTF, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, is?
Absolutely. So Mass Taxpayers Foundation, we've been around for more than 90 years, and we're basically a public policy think tank here in Massachusetts that focuses on public policy issues that relate to the state's long-term economic health. So we do a lot of work related to the state budget. We do a lot of work, as our name implies, related to tax issues, economic development issues, and really we try to look even more broadly at what are the issues that kind of make Massachusetts tick and how we can make sure we have a Massachusetts that works for our business sector, but also our residents and folks who want to invest in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, you guys do some really great work. Like I said, I lean on you guys constantly throughout the year. One of my other co-hosts, my colleague Katie Green, who does our marketing events, calls me the government affairs policy nerd. But for those of us who follow along, this stuff is super important. It's important to stay on top of, to understand kind of what's happening on Beacon Hill, the state of finance, and where our tax dollars are going.
Exactly. And one of the things we try to do, and I really want to highlight the work of the team at Mass Taxpayers, our budget work, which is led by our research director, Megan Callahan, our work on, say, unemployment insurance, led by Pablo Suarez. Victoria Bergeron on our team does our child care work. Andy Bagley does our transportation work. It's really trying to take these things that are complicated. Everyone's busy. Right. Your ability to kind of understand what's going on in the state budget is probably relatively limited from day to day. So we want to make sure you have a resource that you can look at and say, okay, this makes sense to me. This is what matters to me. How can I get a quick hit on what's going on and what I should be kind of focused on moving forward?
Yes, absolutely. And you guys do briefings. You guys do reports, which are both incredibly helpful. Sometimes, like you said, you're busy, all of a sudden an unemployment issue comes up. It's good to go back to look at that. Or you guys did a presentation and recorded it, I believe. So super, super valuable. So I definitely highly encourage anyone to check you guys out for the work you guys doing is really, really great under your leadership.
Thank you.
So one of the reasons I had you in today is you guys, one of the reports that I was just referring to that you just put together is your Competitiveness Index. Mm-hmm. Here in Massachusetts, we hear from our members, residents constantly, oh, it's so expensive to be here, it's expensive to do business here, it's expensive to live here. And sometimes it's like, is that true? Or are we just complaining because we're from Massachusetts and that's what we do? But you guys took a pretty comprehensive look at 27 different metrics and analyzed how Massachusetts ranks competitively to the rest of the country. Is that right? Do you want to tell us a little about the Competitiveness Index?
Yeah, so this is some work we started really about a year and a half ago, and I think this has always been a topic of conversation. How are we doing? How are we doing compared to our peer states? How are we doing compared to the rest of the nation? But especially, I think, during the pandemic and after the pandemic, where there was this perception that things were changing, right? The world was changing around us. I think more than a perception, a reality, the world was changing around us. And so maybe the things that we had been particularly good at historically mattered less, maybe some of them mattered more, or maybe there were areas that were becoming increasing areas of competitive weakness. And what you find in a lot of the public discourse on those issues is the conversations can be kind of unfulfilling, right? Because you've got one group of people saying we're the best place in the world and everyone should be quiet about anything we're not good at, and another group of people who seem to complain about everything that we do, and it's amazing that anyone lived here to begin with. And so we wanted to take a more objective look to say, listen, let's identify some metrics that I think a reasonable person would highlight as things that matter, right? The quality of our wage base, the quality of our economic sectors, the quality of our education system, quality of life metrics. Let's try to put them all together. Let's look at how we rank. Let's compare them to the rest of the nation. Let's compare them to a cohort of economic competitors. Let's compare them to ourselves, and then let's look at them over time. So we did our first one in 2024, and then we published our second one this past fall. And exactly as you say, it's an attempt to try to provide a common language so that people are still going to disagree about whether this shapes up to us being great or poor, and people are going to feel however they feel, but hopefully at least providing some data to back it up. And one thing I'll say is, one of the things we wanted to add this year was a poll component, right? Because the data matter, but people's perception matter as well. And I'm sure that's something we'll talk about in this conversation. But it was really interesting in that to see where the data and the perception match up and where you see some big differences.
Yeah, it is really interesting to see that, because you guys hosted an event with Greater Boston Chamber.
Exactly.
It was AIM part of?
We did a housing event with AIM a couple weeks before that.
Okay, that's what it was. Yes,
the Chamber.
Yes, right. So, you guys presented the findings, which was pretty interesting. I thought I would agree more with the poll. But I guess I'm really in the weeds in a lot of this stuff too. So maybe I'm not just the general public who so do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about the poll a little? Well, why don't
Sure.
why don't we get back to that? Let's talk about the competitiveness and what you found, and then maybe we'll get into the
Absolutely.
poll. But so I don't want to jump ahead too much. So. But I think it's really important. We had Representative Carol Fiola on a few weeks back, and we're talking about competitiveness, and she's on economic development. And I do think it's important. I said this to her, that when we talk about some of our challenges, we also acknowledge and appreciate some of our strengths, right? So what would you say are some of the strengths that you found out of those 27 metrics? Where do we rank amongst the top in the country?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and we'll come back to that when we talk at the poll, because the reality is that people generally think positively about many core elements of Massachusetts, and that's a good thing, right? It's good that people like aspects of why they live here. If everyone was looking for a way to get out, that would be a real challenge. And so when you look at what we're good at objectively, it's the quality of our K-12 system statewide. Now, obviously, there's variety from district to district, school to school. Happy to discuss that. But statewide, our K-12 system ranks consistently first in the nation. Our private and public higher education system ranks quite well. The share of our residents who have a college degree is consistently first in the nation. Our wages are consistently first or second in the nation, depending on how you look at the metrics, and in a lot of our quality of life metrics. So, life expectancy, public safety metrics, things like that. And so when you pull those together, I always say, if you were going to have a draft about what states could have, like best K-12 system in the nation, most intersection between your economic sectors in a highly educated workforce, good K-12 public and private higher education system, those things would go very high in that draft. So when you think about what we have, those are some really good strengths. And the other thing that should be a positive related to those strengths, but only if we don't get complacent, is unlike if our strength was our access to a natural resource or something like that, theoretically, we have it within our power to maintain our strength in our K-12 system and in our higher education system, right? It's not just, hey, we had this great natural resource and now we've depleted it. This is something that potentially can self-perpetuate, provided, again, we don't get complacent and we make sure we continue to focus on it. So those are really some pretty incredible strengths.
Right. And then we'll jump into the negatives, but before or where we rank a little lower, I think you're right when you talk about the draft in particular. Like, I'm a young person raising my family here, and those things are, of course, they're at the top of the draft. Maybe top 3, right? They might go top 3 off the board. But then the reality of where you're going to live and how are you going to pay for it starts to set in. So going into where do we kind of rank lower nationally in some of those metrics?
And it's all about cost, right? And now I think this gets back to what I said earlier about how the pandemic really, I think, made these conversations more pointed. Massachusetts has always been a higher cost state, right, for a variety of reasons that we can get into. And one of the arguments over time has been, hey, we're a higher cost state, but we're also a higher wage state. We are a state that provides more public services. And so it matters less than you might think, because you're going to maybe earn more in Massachusetts, so the fact that we're higher cost matters less. Now, whether or not that's true, people can debate. But one thing that I think has changed in recent years is people are more able to maybe work remotely. Some people maybe have better ability to have work-life balance, kind of a work-life balance that allows them to be home. And at the same time, some of the cost escalation factors in Massachusetts have grown faster here than in other places. And so the kind of pain point of that cost has become more pronounced. And I think that's really the thesis for why it matters even more now. But when you look at where we rank poorly, I mean, it really is kind of just a laundry list of cost issues, right? You start with energy. Healthcare is a place that we've seen an uptick in recent years. You look at childcare costs, right? You look at housing costs. You name the costs that whether you're a family, whether you're an employer, the things that you need to spend money on to succeed in a place, Massachusetts is going to cost you more than many other places, including in some cases places that are geographically proximate, right? So you might be able to move to New Hampshire, move even to the southern part of Maine, still maintain a connection, or Rhode Island in this neck of the woods, still maintain a connection to Massachusetts, but maybe have a slightly lower cost. So that's really where you see, both in the data and when we talk about the poll in the perception, I think those concerns.
Yeah, and I think particularly for like southeastern Massachusetts, we talk about the pay you're just referring to. We have a high, amongst the highest earners in the country. I think, or at least it feels like there's a difference, particularly within, I don't know, maybe the 495 or the 95 kind of corridors there. And then when you get outside of that, I think there's a drop, right? And but the price of energy and the price of healthcare doesn't necessarily drop. And the price of housing does, of course, a little bit. Yeah. No doubt about that. But it's still expensive if you've been from this area. Yet the connection to Boston, we do have South Coast Rail, which is great. We do like that. Ridership is up. But the access via car is incredibly challenging. And commute times are challenging. So I think there's a disconnect sometimes, or we feel a disconnect down here on the South Coast, where we get some of the costs without some of the benefits necessarily.
Absolutely. And it's funny. We've done this competitiveness index 2 years in a row. We'll do a third. And Massachusetts is a small state geographically, right? But we are absolutely a state of regions. But it's this interesting hybrid where we're a state of regions, but at least for the regions, maybe Worcester and East, there's still this close connection to Boston. And so in some cases, you have this interesting dynamic where, so for example, the median household income in Massachusetts is a little over $100,000, right? In Bristol County, it's $80,000. Okay. In Fall River, it's $50,000, right? And so now, there are elements of cost of living in Fall River that are less than in Boston or other places, but if you're living in Fall River and working in Boston, you're still importing a lot of those cost dynamics that are priced for folks who are making maybe significantly more. And so we see this disconnect in some cases where even in some of those strengths, like we're a higher wage state, that is absolutely true. Yep. However, if you're in some of the suburbs of Worcester County, you're in South Coast, southeastern Mass, your lived experiences can be profoundly different than that state level. And I think that's something that we absolutely see, not to keep teasing the poll, but you absolutely see some of those perception differences among the regions in the poll, because I think the reality is different.
Right. And so why don't we quit teasing it and we talk about, so the poll, who did the poll? What was the poll?
Yeah, so we worked with the MassInc polling group, Steve Cazella and his team over there, who were fantastic. And what we wanted to do, right, is, so the objective metrics we use, what we wanted to make sure is that this is not black box metrics. These are things that someone can click on the link and go and look at the data themselves, make sure we're not making it up. But the data are great. But what people feel matters, right? I can tell someone that, don't worry, your commute time is X. If you feel like your commute time's terrible, that's what's going to make you want to move, make you not want to move. Right. So we did the poll statewide, but we also broke it into 6 or 7 regions. And one of the real things that jumped out was the region of the state that consistently, I think, wasn't quite as positive as certainly inside 128 was southeastern Massachusetts, right? And I think what you saw there was maybe less enthusiasm for the education system. Yep. And you also saw, I think, exactly the dynamic that we were just talking about, where you're kind of the economic opportunity down here is not as strong as it is in Boston, and so you're kind of importing some of those cost challenges without necessarily with a longer commute, right? Yeah. With some of those other things, right. And so we absolutely see that in the data. Now there is a dynamic there where kind of the closer you are to downtown Boston, it seemed like in the polling data that we did, the more positive you're going to be on our strengths and the less focused you're going to be on the weaknesses. And then moving south and to some extent moving towards the Worcester area, you see those perceptions change. Now, big picture, how each of those regions viewed our strengths and weaknesses is relatively consistent. So it's really a question of degree. You continue to see that healthcare and education quality are seen as the real kind of stars of Massachusetts, what people identify. But consistently, people are concerned with cost, right? And they see that at a business level. They see that from a tax standpoint. Both businesses and individuals, you see that from an energy standpoint. And then from an individual standpoint, it's childcare, it's housing, and it's commute times.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, we are we're sitting in Fall River right now, and New Bedford's, depending on where you are, about a 60-mile drive to Boston, or 60 miles distance to Boston. But that can be, so if you're going to Logan at, 11:30 at night or coming home, it's a 60-minute drive, maybe just a little over that. But to go to an MTF event at 9 a.m. On a Tuesday, you got to plan for 2.5 hours. Because it could be an hour and a half, it could be 2 hours, could be 2.5 hours. So you don't know. So I think some of that perception is, the commute might actually take me an hour and 45 minutes. Like that's the reality. But last time it took me 2 hours and 15 minutes. So that perception I think really matters. So it's interesting that southeastern Massachusetts was a little more disingenuous or disappointed, I should say, in the state of things. So where would you find that we shifted? Because this is the report you've done now, right, on the second competitiveness index. Where did you find that we gained ground or lost ground between the 2 years?
Yeah, so the reality is, and you want this to be the case, is that kind of the bones of what we're good at remain relatively consistent, and also it's hard to change a weakness overnight, right? We're not going to all of a sudden have the most affordable housing in the nation, right? But we did see a couple areas that I think showed some significant change and really have some interesting policy implications. So on the positive side, the biggest change you saw was an increase in labor force size, right? Okay. Which, given the long-standing demographic challenges that every northeastern state has, but certainly Massachusetts has, that was a real eye-opener, right? And Massachusetts had really struggled during the pandemic and kind of people voting with their feet and losing folks. So we saw a real change in that dynamic. That was almost entirely attributable to immigration, right? So we continued to struggle with what's called domestic migration. So people choosing to move to other states from Massachusetts more than people from other states moved to Massachusetts. But we saw this real boom in the last 18 months, again, from 2023 into 2024, related to immigration. And that had a real positive impact on our labor force side. So that was on the positive front. Okay. On the negative front, two things jumped out. One, our unemployment rate ticked up, and for a long time our unemployment rate has been, at the same level or slightly lower than the national rate. We're now slightly above the national rate, so it's still from a historical perspective, totally, it's not by any means at crisis levels, but you're just starting to see some signs there about an economy that's not firing on all cylinders. Mm-hmm. The other thing that you really notice on the cost front is on healthcare premiums. So we went from 35th in the nation in terms of employer healthcare premium costs to 48th, right? And that was more than $1,000 more employee on the premium side that you're paying. Now, we've always been a high-cost healthcare state, and actually for a while, I think Massachusetts did a very good job in terms of managing healthcare costs compared to other states. Mm-hmm. And as seen in the poll, I think people have a lot of confidence, generally speaking, in the healthcare system in Massachusetts from a quality standpoint. Right. But you're starting to see that real shift on the cost front, and that's something that I think policymakers really need to stand up and take a look at, because that's something that is just going to add to the the housing, the energy, the childcare cost front that we already talked about. Right.
And to go back, so I wanted to touch on a couple things that you mentioned. Domestic migration. Yeah. And I know you've talked about this. What groups are leaving? Is there a certain group that is more concerning than others?
Yeah, and this gets back to, again, kind of why we put the index together a couple years ago, because there was all these, in some cases, good conversations, but in a lot of cases, I think kind of lazy conversations about who's leaving Massachusetts. And what I mean by lazy is you had some elements of the conversation says, oh, it's only low-income people leaving who can't afford to live here, or oh, it's only wealthy people who are leaving because of tax policy changes or things like that, and so therefore we need to just focus on this one group.
Right.
And like everything in life, it's not quite that simple, right? When you look at who is leaving Massachusetts disproportionate to their share of the population, three things emerge. It is true that lower middle-class families are leaving at a rate, kind of disproportionate to their share of the population, which absolutely implies a cost crunch, right? That folks are being priced out, especially maybe people with young families and things like that.
Right.
You also see wealthy folks leaving at rates disproportionate to the share of the population. And the reality is we need to keep both of those groups here in Massachusetts. So we can't have a policy approach that just focuses on the wealthy. We can't have a policy approach that just focuses on lower income, because both matter. But the thing that to me really unifies it and is really the most concerning from a policy front is the age group we see leaving Massachusetts is 26 to 35 or 26 to 44, depending on what data source you use. But basically, young people, people starting their career, people starting their families, and that should be a unifying call to action for all of us, because that's our future workforce for the next 10 years, and their kids are our future workforce for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Right. So if we're losing those folks because they can't afford to raise a family here, that's something that really has a long-term implication for Massachusetts. And I think that unifies, hopefully, some of the thinking in terms of policy action.
Right. And, we talked about going back to the draft, right? So some of those positives, they might go top off the board. But those young families, you need housing. You're hoping to buy a house, right? You're gonna have childcare costs, and you gotta have energy. Like those things are those you need to do, or you aspire to do, right? And if you can't do those things, it doesn't really matter if the healthcare is the best in the country or the education is the best. If you can't do those things.
Exactly. So to extend my sports metaphor farther than I probably should, now let's imagine these things are free agents. And the fact of the matter is, if you can't afford the free agent of quality education or quality healthcare because it's just too expensive, you're going to go somewhere that may be a little less good but a little more affordable.
Right. And to extend it one line further, if I remember, even Belichick mentioned this has an impact on recruiting. NFL players to come to Massachusetts, like you were saying, those high earners, because of the tax policy. But we won't get into that. The other piece I wanted to mention, unemployment insurance. Mm-hmm. You mentioned it briefly, and I would like to, maybe have MTF back on again to discuss it, because unemployment insurance is a huge issue for the members of the One South Coast Chamber. We hear about it constantly. We talk to our legislators about it constantly. So I don't want to dive too in, because we could have a whole podcast just on unemployment insurance. Sure. But we rank amongst the most expensive in the country in unemployment. Do you want to give what's your perspective on the high level reflection on unemployment insurance in Massachusetts and where we're heading?
Sure. Well, and first I do want to thank you and One South Coast for, I think, being consistent partners on unemployment insurance and thinking about policy implications and what we do about it and those types of things, because it is a critical issue. So in our index, we rank something like 37th in the nation in terms of highest unemployment insurance costs. And honestly, that's shocking in that we're not 50th or something like that, but there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is when we look at the national ranking as included in our index, that only includes old school unemployment insurance taxes. Whereas in Massachusetts, there's an additional state level surcharge that all unemployment insurance payers pay that isn't included in those national rankings. So if we were to include that, we would rank around 50th, right?
Okay.
And so we absolutely, I think, are in a position where our unemployment insurance system, I think, needs to be reformed. And I want to credit the Healy administration. I think they have convened folks to start to talk about how do we do that. And unemployment insurance is a challenging policy issue, right? Because at the end of the day, there's kind of two inputs. There's how much you pay in and who gets those benefits. And the only way you reduce cost in the system or you improve solvency is you either pay people less in benefits or you ask people to pay more into the system, right? And so you're going to have two important constituencies, workers and employers, who are very vested in terms of what are you doing and how does it impact me. And so this is why this has been a policy issue that I think we haven't seen major reforms in more than 2 decades. But it is something that, especially, following the pandemic, when we had just an absolute unprecedented influx in claims on the unemployment insurance system, and then we had this revelation that we had somehow misapplied $2 billion in federal funding. The state now has to pay us back. Like, if there's ever a time for unemployment insurance reform, I think now is that time. Right. And the good news is, I use the word good news sparingly, but I guess the opportunity for reform is we can make adjustments to our system, still have the most, I think, kind of generous suite of benefits in the nation, and reduce cost in that system. I think there is capacity to do that, and do that in a way that doesn't put us out of step with other high-cost states, but provides meaningful savings to employers. Now, how you do that, how you build consensus on that, that's going to take a little bit of time, but I think there absolutely is a path to do that.
Yeah, and it's encouraging to hear that the Healey administration is looking on this. She's taking input from leaders like yourself on the best way to to move forward with that.
And just on that very quickly, I do want to say, so Pablo Suarez on our team has written a couple publications, because unemployment insurance is also not the world's easiest policy area to kind of wrap your heads around. Right. It is a complicated system. If you're looking for a primer on how the system works, I'd really call you to the work that Pablo's done. And just a little tease going forward, I think we'll start to put out some ideas on some work that he's done about, okay, so how exactly can we change this system in a way that I think works for claimants, but also works for the solvency and savings to the fund.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I've tuned into one of Pablo's updates, and he does an incredible job. It's very complicated. We have a government affairs committee. They're the members who express a special interest in government affairs, and we typically meet with our legislators. So a couple months back, we did one on unemployment insurance, and I did an overview for the business owners and the members and the legislators, because even if you're in this and you're running your business,
Absolutely.
It's so complicated. How did we get to where we are in this unemployment insurance, and where are we going? Because costs are going to continue to increase if something's not done soon.
Absolutely.
So, as we were giving credit to the Healey administration for convening the group on unemployment, I also want to, we've done a lot of talking about some of the positives and some of the negatives, but it's important to acknowledge that the Healey administration has recently pulled together a task force, the Competitiveness Task Force. It's a group. I'm excited to be serving on it for One South Coast. Doug is going to be serving on it as well for the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. We've had one meeting so far, and we're excited to at least start to explore opportunities to make Massachusetts more competitive. What do you think? What are your thoughts initially on the task force and pulling that group together, Doug?
Yeah, I do think that was pleased when it was announced, and to see a membership in terms. So it's from an executive order that Governor Healey put forward, that it's got a broad membership that is inclusive of a variety of folks on the employment side. You've also got labor representatives, obviously public officials, because competitiveness means different things to different people. And so I think one of the really important elements of that group's work kind of off the bat is, what do we mean by competitiveness, right? What are we trying to solve for? What are we trying to fix? And I think there is real opportunity to find consensus on something like that, right? I mean, from our perspective with the index, at a basic point, we want Massachusetts to be a place that people want to live in, work in, start businesses in, and invest in, right? And one would imagine that should be a premise that I think has pretty broad consensus. Now, how you do that, there's going to be so many opportunities to diverge in terms of the kind of tactics, but if we can agree on that strategy of how do we put in place policies that lead to that, I think that's a really good foundation to start. And as we think about the mixing and matching of whether it's public policy or whether it's just how we think about supporting, again, our education system or things like that, I think it's going to lead us to some pretty clear conclusions. And one thing I would, kind of an example of that I would give, right, is mention that K-12 is a historic strength in Massachusetts. We've ranked first in the nation nationally, basically with a couple of exceptions, for 20-some-odd years, right? Our schools, though, post-pandemic, have recovered more slowly than most other states, okay? And as we all know, where you go in Massachusetts, you see a wide variety in the quality of public education. we cannot take the quality of our K-12 public education schools for granted, nor that can we assume, because we're first in the nation nationally, that the quality of our schools in every community in Bristol County and every community in the state is high quality. We have to make sure we retain that, because guess what? We're not finding a natural resource tomorrow that is, that no one's ever thought of, right? We're not going to compete and win next year because of something that's not related to the quality of our education system, the quality of our workforce, and economic sectors that relate to that. And so when you look at, for example, the state's graduation requirement, which has really been kind of thrown into turmoil now that we don't have a statewide graduation requirement anymore because of a ballot question from last year, coming up with a graduation standard that's consistent, that's rigorous, that includes something that's consistently implemented statewide. I know it seems like probably an issue that's secondary to competitiveness, but for us, we think that is central to this conversation, right? Because that is what we're good at. It's a place where we have an opportunity to, lengthen our lead, as you hear people talk about all the time. But if we just assume it's going to be good forever no matter what we do, and we lose that, well, then you're really behind the eight ball.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's so important. I went into that first meeting thinking about the negatives, right? Unemployment, energy, healthcare costs, things like that. But it's so important that where we are leaders, that we maintain that and going forward. So I'm glad, and I think that was pretty clear in that first meeting, that we need to make sure we're not just focusing on what we can fix, but focusing as well on how do we maintain what we're good at. So I'm looking forward to the work that coming up on that committee. That should be great. So, Doug, before I let you go, I want to make sure to give you guys a shout out and let our listeners know where they can find you. You guys, as we've talked about, you guys do incredible work. You're an incredible organization with so many tools, whether it's the reports or the webinars that you host or the in-person meetings. Where can people find you on social medias, websites, whatever the best place to find you is?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, we publish, we're actually publishing our annual report for last year today, and so these numbers at the top of my head, I think we published 58 reports last year, right? So the number one place to go to find that work is our website, masstaxpayersfoundation.org. And I will say also, we actually are offering an open house, a virtual open house related to the governor's FY27, fiscal year 27 budget proposal. That's going to be on Friday, January 30th. So there's information on that if folks want to log in and register for that. Happy to get people engaged in MTF. We're on Twitter or X. We're on LinkedIn. I won't try to reel off our handles and get them wrong, but look for us. I'm sure you'll find us.
Yeah, we'll tag you in this post too when we do it on social media.
Absolutely, but all the normal places. And what I will say too is on our website you'll see our incredibly talented staff list. You'll see my name and contact information. We want to be a resource, right? So folks should reach out via email, via phone. Happy to chat anytime.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Yeah, Doug, you have a great team. You're doing a great job at the helm there. So we can't thank you enough. We can't thank you for coming down and visiting us today. So we'll close it out there. So thank you for listening and tuning in to the One South Coast Chamber podcast. Make sure to follow, subscribe, and leave a review for the show wherever you get your podcasts. And also remember to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok at One South Coast Chamber for daily updates. Thanks, and see you next time.